Éilis is the trainer today, and Éilis has been a development education practitioner and activist for a number of years, working for Financial Justice Ireland and Trócaire. And Financial Justice Ireland, I suppose, are one of the few maybe actors in development education in Ireland who are consistently addressing themes of economic justice and global finance. And so Éilis has a lot of experience in that area. And she's also written policy papers on housing finance and public solutions to the Irish housing crisis. She's also been a Dublin city councillor and has pursued these policies in that local context as well.
Okay, so I might as well get our two speakers who are present so far to start, Rodrigo and Michelle. Just a quick one sentence about yourself will be fine, I think, and we'll do more extensive introductions when you start speaking. So Rodrigo.
Yes, hello, my name is Rodrigo Fernandez. I'm based in Amsterdam. I work part-time at Trinity College Dublin as a postdoc, and I work at an NGO here in Amsterdam called SOMO, and we study multinationals. And I've done research into the financialization of real estate in Europe and the global south in the last 10 years. I'm sorry, that's a bit longer than a sentence.
Michelle.
Hello, everybody. I'm Michelle Norris. I'm head of the Geary Institute for Public Policy in UCD, University College Dublin, and I'm Professor of Social Policy. I work on housing issues in terms of my research, mainly social housing provision, and I chair the board of the Housing Finance Agency, which is the main financer of social housing in Ireland, and I'm also a member of the board of the Land Development Agency, the public land banking agency recently set up. So I kind of mix a bit of academic work and practice work in the area.
Great, thanks, Michelle. So yeah, so I suppose just to set the context, a lot of this is so familiar to people. I know it probably seems almost redundant to go over it, but just to set the context, I suppose in terms of the housing crisis in Ireland today, there's 100,000 people waiting on housing on social housing waiting lists. Of those, 18,000 are waiting for more than 7 years. 8,200 are homeless, including 2,200 children. And in Dublin, apart from homelessness, the average rent in the private sector is about 41% of a tenant's income, and 20% spend more than half their salary on rent. So there's striking statistics that show, I suppose, the scale of the crisis and the impact it's having on a huge, huge number of people as a percentage of the population. So the government response has been one to focus primarily on the role of private finance. So I suppose previously, prior maybe to the global financial crisis, the greatest low place for finance in the Irish housing market was through lending of private mortgages when it came to private residential property. But increasingly, private finance is also driving private rental, as a lot of you will be familiar with through stories of real estate investment trusts, and also the social housing market in Ireland. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So why is this important in terms of, I suppose, social solidarity and in terms of anti-racism? Well, when people are faced with crisis or oppression, which certainly, if you look to those statistics, there's an awful lot of the population of Ireland personally affected by significant housing crisis and an absence of one of their basic rights. And when faced like that, by that, people look for a narrative to explain the situation. They look for some reasonable explanation that shows why they're being made to face such hardship. And it's important for us to look to what are the options available, in what narratives are being proposed to people about why this is happening. So the first narrative that's proposed is, I suppose, what you might call the mainstream liberal narrative of the crisis since 2008, which broadly tells us that the guarantee of the banks was a success, that the setup of NAMA was a success, and that that Ireland recovered from the housing crisis. Unlike countries like Greece, Ireland recovered and did the sensible thing. And consistently, year on year, reports come from government through the media of that the housing crisis is improving, that things are getting better, that there is more supply. And obviously that's quite problematic because people just know that it doesn't match their lived realities. So that mainstream narrative is not convincing people. The second narrative that's promoted is what you might call a far-right narrative, heavily promoted through, I suppose, social media, through certain far-right political organizations, and increasingly through more standard and typical main media organizations such as Gript. And that's narrative is telling people that housing is in fixed supply, that our population is rising due to migration, and that this is causing a crisis in housing. And it's quite clear that this is totally inaccurate, but it is a narrative that's being proposed to people who are very much looking for an explanation. And so then I suppose the final thing that we have to think about is, what is the third possible narrative? What is the anti-racist narrative that we might want to propose that can actually convince people of what we've been speaking about? Or convince people that the housing crisis does not stem from a lack of supply and an increase in migrants, that that's not accurate, that there is another explanation. And I guess where this workshop came from was from the sense that it's not sufficient to just tell people that racism is bad, that it's morally not a nice thing, that we also have to provide an alternative narrative that's rooted in global solidarity. So if we want to convince people who are homeless that they aren't homeless because of an influx of migrants, we have to give them a convincing reason and a convincing explanation as to why they do face a housing crisis. And ideally, this is one that's rooted in values of global solidarity and enables people to see that the crisis they're experiencing is one experienced by people in many, many different countries. And so this workshop, I suppose, tries to examine the impact that finance is having on housing in Ireland and on housing in the global south in a way that helps people to see those similarities and those shared oppressions. So just to kind of, I suppose, set the scene for the role of finance in housing in Ireland, this is just a couple of quotes from a website called capitalflow.ie, which is a website aimed at private investors and funds looking for opportunities to invest in housing. And this article from the last couple of months looks at social housing opportunities for property investors. So it says that in the government's action plan, local authorities are seeking to lease tens of thousands of residential properties for 20 to 25 years under a leasing scheme. From a practical perspective of owning and maintaining a property, it takes away the whole hassle of time and cost. The government is responsible for maintaining the property. If the boiler blows or there's normal wear and tear, it's for the government to sort out, not for you as a landlord. You can get that nice feel-good factor, knowing you're making a real difference to somebody's life while making a safe, prudent investment at the same time. So as we can see, social housing, which was something that was provided as a public good, is increasingly becoming wrapped up in the same types of finance that previously caused a crisis in the mortgage markets. And that's a trend that we see right across the global north and the global south. So that's going to be the focus of a lot of what we're discussing today. So yeah, so and I suppose it's summed up in this phrase of housing financialization, a process through which the production, finance and purchase of housing are predominantly driven by financial motives rather than a will to use this housing as homes. So that's taken from Manuel Alvarez. And the key, I suppose, factor there is that the home, which was once considered a public service of a type or as a right of a type, is increasingly being seen as a commodity to make money from. So our first three speakers are going to look at some of those topics in a little bit more detail. Let me stop sharing. So we're going to hand over to our three speakers for the next short while. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Rodrigo Fernandez. I came across Rodrigo's work through Financial Justice Ireland, and he's going to be speaking about how some of the decisions made in the global north after the financial crisis led to the growth of financialization of housing in the global south. So Rodrigo, I'll just hand over to you there now, if you don't mind.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to this event. It's a very interesting topic. It is identical to the debates we have, for example, here in the Netherlands. I worked for many years with Manuel Albers, from which the quote was at the University of Leuven, and we worked on looking at financialization of real estate in different countries. And one of the striking things was that in all of these countries, the public debates were always nationally focused, and always the idea was that in this country, this is a unique problem, and it is something that is very rare to see in national debates, that people are able to really put the connection of the national problems with much more overarching structural developments. And I think that, well, there are some clear benefits from not doing that for certain political parties. Well, let me not go into that. So I was asked to do two things: to give an introduction into financialization and to lay the connection with the global south when it comes to real estate, because these are two very large topics. I hope I will come around to the second one, but I think that Raquel Rolnik will do that, will be able to do that also much better if I don't get to it. So first of all, I wanted to really put it in a much larger context, because probably, as you will see, have in Ireland, the answer is to build more, to basically to ease the tensions on the housing market. But this continuous focus on simply as to build more and not being able to relate it to the much broader process of financialization, I think that is one of the, well, fundamental problems of why we're not able to see where it comes from. So if we look at it from a perspective of a longue durée, a long-term view on history, we can see that periods of financialization have been here before. The last period, the previous period, was from 1870 up until the First World War. Basically, the age of imperialism, when the British Empire was still a center of global capitalism. Then and now, as in previous periods of financialization, what we see is an economic model that is not sustainable. Many of the developments we see in housing, we can see much more broadly in the economy, as well as, oh, Raquel Rolnik is entering, as well as at the global level. And what it is that we have an economic model that revolves around a growing stock of debt. It's a debt-driven model, and the other side of the balance sheet of debt are assets. And so what we see is that the balance sheet in relation to income simply rises and rises each year. And the effect of this is that basically you're moving more and more into the future. You're taking on more and more future income streams from the future to pay for today. And this is fundamentally an unsustainable model, particularly if we introduce the need to change because of climate change in the mix. So it is unsustainable and quite damaging. Unfortunately, it is not moving more. Here it is. So in this model of financialization, profits are increasingly generated by the financial sector, extracted by rentier structures, and the financial sector and owners of capital take on a much larger share of all value that is being created. It doesn't only lead to a rise in inequality at the global level, but it also leads to a shift in macroeconomic patterns. Another element that is part of financialization is that it brings with it another way of seeing the world. It is a calculative practice, sometimes referred to as balance sheet capitalism, that makes it unable for financial agents, for managers to see a university or childcare or anything else, but simply a balance sheet that can be manipulated in the same way using the same financial techniques that at the end enables them to extract more value for shareholders at the expense of others. Another important element is the role of the state and the financialization of the state. Because of the time limitations, I will not go into this, but I think it's clear for everyone that the state is an essential part of facilitating this whole process of being a guarantor and pushing the whole process further. What we've also seen is that there's been a shift in the power relations of finance. What we refer to as finance is not a constant factor in this short history of financialization, basically since the 1980s. So if we look back to the global financial crisis, at the center were large systemic banks that had operated through shadow banks, securitized mortgages, and so on. Since then, global financial markets have moved on, and it's become much more capital market based. Systemic banks have moved to the back, and large institutional investors have become much more important. And so what we see is that next to the structural power these large financial actors have, so simply put, to set the agenda, what can be discussed, what are the limits to the possibilities, there's an infrastructural element, which means that states cannot exercise their power to be fully sovereign without capital markets. Just as we see with the pharmaceutical industry, states cannot act sovereignly without vaccines being produced privately. Central banks now need the infrastructure that capital markets provide them, basically, to act the way they want, and it is to be buying up financial assets to maintain stability. And the last element I would like to touch upon, sorry that I have to go through this so quickly, but these are just simply some elements to really cast the net wide, is that financialization also comes with a change in the culture of in our daily lives, and very importantly, it comes with a shift in electoral preferences. As we become all alienated and pushed into this worldview from the point of view of asset owners, our electoral preferences change with that. Financialization also should be, or can also be easily understood as being nested in these larger historical manifestations: globalization, neoliberalism, and financialization. They come together, they reinforce each other, they are attached to each other. They do not work in isolation. And lastly, the short history of financialization since the 1980s shows that we have seen this constant rise of asset and thus debt. And this is the big force, this wall of money, increasing, always looking for objects to be financialized, be it real estate or otherwise. So this is where real estate basically comes in. So real estate is simply one of these many objects that are being transformed into assets in this much broader debt-led regime. So when we talk about the financialization of real estate, it is not it doesn't work in isolation of these much larger regime transformations. And I think that if we want to work towards a counter narrative, if we want to understand the root causes, it needs to be contextualized in a much broader system. And also, it must be recognized that land, bricks and mortar, the important elements of real estate, they are a very specific type of object that is being transformed into an asset, because it is a perfect base for a collateral. It is a much better base for collateral than, for instance, childcare that can go bankrupt land, bricks and mortar, real estate, at the end, there's always something left. If they're in the case of bankruptcy, people always need to live somewhere. It will always be in demand. And so this is why the global valuation of real estate assets is estimated today to be around $28 trillion, which is it's roughly a third of all assets under management of institutional investors worldwide. And this makes it really one of the largest and most important asset classes in the world.
Rodrigo, that's actually 10 minutes now, I'm afraid.
Okay. Can I touch upon the global south, or do I have to stop?
Yes, please.
Okay. So that was basically a very quick introduction into financialization. So how does it affect the global south differently from countries in the global north? Well, I think that it is very important to understand that countries in the global south, in the periphery, they are integrated in the global economy from a subordinate position. And so there's different ways to understand the subordinate position and how this affects the way in which financialization plays out. So one of the most simple ways to approach it is the monetary hierarchy. That means the ability for a national economy to emit debt in its own currency. So the US can do that. Countries from the European Union can do that. Not all, but the UK can do that. But as you move down the hierarchy, less and less countries are able to do that, and that's why they have to emit debt in another currency. And this is where many problems start, and this is why they become takers in the global structures. They are not fully sovereign when it comes to monetary matters, and so they have much more fragile capital markets in general than the capital markets we see at the core, and they become victims of what we now have seen, global liquidity cycles. So global liquidity cycles are the result of financial globalization, that national markets have become more interlinked, and that a rise of overall liquidity. So with this, it means freely available capital to invest. We can see that certain countries become awash with cash. So this is to go back to the wall of money that goes into countries to assetize, for instance, real estate or other parts. So this global liquidity cycle has affected countries in the global south in a particular way since the global financial crisis. And this has to do with going back to the monetary hierarchy. So this is the last point I will make, Éilis. I will not touch on the last 3 points. Is that what we are seeing is that central banks at the core of the global economy, so the US, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, they are able to basically create money out of thin air. These are the quantitative easing programs they have to basically to sustain systemic stability. And this money that was created, then is being created and got a new push with the pandemic, is basically thrown on global markets, and much of this liquidity has found its way into emerging market economies that have no way in stopping this wall of money. And so this is a very clear effect of policies in the global north, which is never part of the discussion at central banks, because central banks have a mandate at their national market to maintain stability in their national market. The European Central Bank only is interested in what happens in the Eurozone, the Fed only what happens in the US. But these are what economists call externalities or unintended effects that I think that, well, they need to be put on the table, discussed and politicized, because these are important sources of the financialization of real estate in the global south. I will keep it to that as a very brief introduction.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. You always seem to have the job of dealing with the heavy information, which is necessary, but we really appreciate it. So thank you. Okay, I'm just going to hand over very quickly to Michelle.
So thanks very much for inviting me along today. Rodriguez and I haven't met, but and we didn't do anything to coordinate our presentations. But actually, a lot of what I have to say echoes. So that's very nice. My kind of comments today are derived from a project I'm working on and just completed, in fact, for UN Habitat and for the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and also for Housing Europe, which is the representative body for social housing providers in Europe, and it's called Housing 2030. So just to flag to you, the project is being launched at the UNECE meeting next week in Geneva. So I'm attending, so I'm very excited about leaving the country, you can imagine. But we're working on the project website at the moment, but just to flag to you, since so many of you are in education, I hope it might be a useful resource for you. So there's the address of the website, and we have included in it the project report that still has to go up because it's been adopted next week, but lots of examples of good practice in relation to support for affordable housing provision from government throughout the UNECE area. So there's 56 countries in the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, none in the global south, but covering quite a large swathe of countries in the global north, from the United States right over to the Urals. So it's a very, very wide world region, including a wide range of different countries in terms of high income and lower income countries. We also have podcasts and a series of conference presentations that we did as part of it. So I hope you find it a useful tool. We're still working on it, so it'll be finished next week. There's quite a lot of information there already. So the project is intended to advise policymakers on practical strategies they can do to address housing affordability problems. So I worked on the chapters on finance for housing with the colleague Julie Lawson from Australia, and also the chapters on land. So I'm going to draw on those to talk to you today about the lessons regarding managing financialization. So much of the discussion about financialization is about what is it, how is it manifested, what are the implications of it, particularly for inequality and particularly for housing unaffordability. So obviously they're extremely important issues, but the discussion around what solutions should be put in place, what can governments do, what can communities do, what can activists do, is far less well developed. And in fact, in terms of responses by government, that's far less well developed. So that's what I wanted to talk to you today about, tools to tame financialization that we came across well speaking to these 56 governments that are in the UNECE area and researching our project. So Éilis defined financialization at the start, and I just thought I would put in another quote from Manuel Albert, who defines financialization as the of finance and financial products and institutions over governments, societies, and households. Rodriguez gave some examples of how that has played out in practice in the global north and in the global south. When the term is used by activists and also even by academics, it's often used inconsistently. So it's not always clear, certainly when I read material, is everyone using a similar definition? And sometimes the difference between finance, which obviously we need finance to pay for housing, housing is expensive to pay for in most countries, but the difference between finance and financialization isn't always clear. But despite that, we do know there is a wall of money, as Rodriguez mentioned, that's been generated by deregulation of banking, deregulation of capital markets internationally, and also by the internationalization of finance markets. So that's a very important phenomenon since the 1970s. It's washing around the world. Housing is a key absorber of this wall of money. So it's invested in many things, but housing is a particularly useful thing to invest in because it's a fixed asset. and also can be used to leverage debt to borrow from. And we also know there is very significant evidence that just the volume of finance in its own right has undermined housing affordability, accessibility, and contributed to housing inequality. Now, of course, like everything, it's complex. So there are other things, obviously, that have contributed to it. So I'm not one of the people who believes supply is not an issue in Ireland. I think supply is a significant issue. But the right type of supply is the solution. But there is a lot of evidence that independently of all those other factors, that the changes in financialisation have had quite a significant impact. And as Rodrigo mentioned, it is fascinating that this is an issue in almost every country, certainly in Western Europe, in the United States, Australia, in higher income countries, also in lower income countries. But in the national debates, that's rarely reflected. The details of how it operates differ depending on the local housing market, laws, financial market, etc. But the broad trend around this wall of money washing into countries and skewing their housing market and creating problems for accessibility for very low income people, but also for people, middle income households who might traditionally have hoped to buy a house. That's a very strong phenomenon internationally, particularly in cities and in successful, growing cities. So just in terms of how to make sense of it all and make sense of the kind of policy responses, obviously it's complicated because there's lots of stuff you can do. You can regulate Airbnb usage, you can stop international investors from buying houses, you can regulate banks, you can regulate foreign investment in different countries, you can do lots of different things. And often the discussion around policy solutions is kind of lost in the detail and the complexities. So I like to think about financialization in terms of financial circuits. It's fundamentally about a circuit of finance circulating between buyers, sellers, investors, etc. in the market. And a good way of thinking about how financialization operates is to think about the growth in the size, the volume of finance in the housing market. So some of you may remember, but there was a time when mortgage lending was rationed in Ireland and you had to queue up and wait till enough people had saved money in the building society could put it all together and lend it to you as a mortgage. So now we're in a completely opposite situation. The scale of finance is huge. The number of circuits of finance is huge. So in the past, in Ireland, local authorities and building societies provided 100% of mortgages until the 1980s. The banks, about 98%, the banks were very minor lenders, and there was very little money in the mortgage market except for that. The state was a major provider of capital for housing. Now there's innumerable circuits of finance, banks, secondary lenders, international investors, etc., etc. So the scale of the circuits has grown, the number of the circuits has grown. The focus of the circuits has changed to focus particularly on, particularly in Ireland, on kind of build to rent and things like that, and move away from provision of housing for the state. And also the cost of circuits has changed. So now, if you're wealthy, you can get super cheap money, and a lot of these international investors in housing effectively have free money. Pension funds effectively have free money to invest in financial markets. But for people with lower incomes, finance remains much more expensive. So for individual mortgage holders, but also for people in lower income countries, interest rates are much higher. So that all accentuates inequality.
About 3 or 4 minutes, Michelle.
Sorry. So I've also decided to just talk about the options to manage financialization, also in relation to those categories. So the options government use to manage the scale of finance, of financial circuits. Oh yeah, sorry. So to cover first the options governments use for managing the scale of financial circuits, most of the activities have involved what's called macroprudential regulation. So particularly after the banking crisis, governments have gone in Europe to regulate banks more closely by, for instance, requiring them to keep certain amounts of capital, limiting mortgage lending to homeowners and individual households, etc. And the rationale for that is to try stabilize the entire financial system rather than necessarily to promote housing on affordability. Some of the problems associated with that is, in some ways, it's an example of closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. So Rodrigo mentioned the increasing importance of non-bank finance, international funds, etc., in the housing market. And we see that in this country and internationally. So they remain largely unregulated, but the ordinary mortgage holder remains very significantly regulated. So that's an immediate limitation. It also is an issue in terms of driving inequality. And also there is lots of evidence that in lots of countries, it's not necessarily the case in Ireland, but these measures are not that successful in addressing housing on affordability, because they're often counterbalanced by countervailing measures that have the opposite effect, like mortgage interest. So in second option, in terms of managing the focus of financial circuits, forgotten now in the dim dark annals of history, prior to the 1980s, governments played a very active role in allocating where banks lent to, and banks were required to lend a proportion to agriculture, a proportion to housing, etc. And increasingly, even though very few governments have got involved in regulating the focus of finance, again, there is a debate developing that really we can't control financialization without regulating this in some way to limit the amount of finance going into housing and bidding up prices. So there's very active debates going on about this in New Zealand, for instance, and the United Nations Environment Programme and the United Nations more broadly has issued some very interesting recommendations around managing finance for environmental projects that are very relevant. So third option then is to address the issue of the number of financial circuits. So to try support the right circuits, the circuits we want, and disable harmful circuits by encouraging speculative investment. So we see things like that happening in New Zealand, where there's extra taxes put on people who sell their homes within 10 years. We see that in Ireland in action to stop investors buying up new estates. We see it internationally in terms of efforts to regulate Airbnb. So part of that involves supporting the type of circuits we need to support things like social housing. So I've given some examples of measures that are used internationally to support social and other non-market forms of housing. Revolving funds, so a fund which lends and then the money is paid back and lends again. Public loans and grants, saving schemes, and the two logos at the bottom are of some of the examples of the biggest savings type schemes in Europe, Casa de Depot in France, and the Sparkasse movement, which is very common in German-speaking countries, savings banks, but is also spreading throughout Eastern Europe. And then the slide at the top looks at the Danish system for financing social housing, where there's initially a state loan, it's paid back by residents through their rents. And then after that, the money is paid back, residents continue to pay rent, and that's revolved, that lump of money, to fund refurbishment and new building. And just to say to you, a particular problem in Ireland is that we don't retain the value of this historic investment by the state in our social housing system. So it leaches out through sales to tenants, things like leasing, Éilis mentioned already. Also within the approved housing body sector, there's effectively an automatic privatisation built in after 40 years, and they're not required to let it as social housing. So part of the issue around supporting the right kind of financial circuits is just ensuring we retain the value of public subsidies.
Probably just one more minute, Michelle, I'd say.
So finally, then in terms of managing the cost of financial circuits, Governments can look at reducing the cost of finance for some purposes, so non-market housing, housing for lower income people, and increasing the cost of finance for other purposes. Cost of finance for things we don't want to happen, like speculation. So levelling the playing field in favour of investment in social and affordable housing can involve things like government guarantees. Sometimes the government have a fund they use to guarantee. Social impact bonds have been used quite widely in finance for environmental projects, not so much in social housing. I think they have potential if managed properly. And then ending privatisation to retain these subsidies in the system. And increasingly within Europe, there is an increasing acknowledgement that these kinds of things are important. Although some aspects of the EU are problematic from the point of view of social investment, I think there is authorities that for balanced housing market as well as. Just one final slide. There are opportunities for governments to get more involved in managing financialization, because as Rodrigo said, financial circuits, financial markets are often either created by governments or shaped by governments. So REITs, for instance, would not exist except the government had passed legislation to make them exist. You know, the enabling legislation is necessary. So governments can create markets and they can manage markets, or suggest they can manage markets as well. But for just to highlight some challenges then, for many governments, traditionally all their interventions in finance for housing have addressed the shortage of finance. So historically, the main issue has been not enough finance for housing. And really, we haven't caught up in terms of developing new tools to manage the excess finance for housing, which is really what financialization is about. And one of the other challenges is there is a disconnect between the site of the problem and the site of the solution. So many of the campaigns around financialization are in cities like Barcelona, Copenhagen, Dublin, where people are really affected at the hard end of financialization. But very few of the solutions really lie within the hands of city governments. They can do some things, but the more fundamental solutions have to come at the national and much more likely international level. So thank you.
Great. That's great, Michelle. Thanks so much. And I think that point around how governments are really the ones who create markets is really important to remember, that it's not a case of these markets operating autonomously, as sometimes we're led to believe. And I'm just going to introduce our final speaker, Raquel Rolnik, who has joined us. So welcome, Raquel, and thank you so much for making the time to join us very early in the morning from Sao Paulo. So Raquel is an urban planner and architect by trade, who has worked in a range of, I suppose, academic roles, but also in practical roles. She worked as the director of planning in the city of Sao Paulo and in the Department for Cities in the Ministry of Cities in the Brazilian government. And also in 2008, she was appointed as a special rapporteur on adequate housing for the United Nations from 2008 to 2014. And in that time, I think she really did a lot to focus in on the role of the lack of adequate housing in the global south, and I suppose the role of finance in that. And her book, Urban Warfare, Housing and Cities in the Age of Finance, is a really, really good read for anybody who's interested. So Brazil really is at the center of developments in the global south in terms of finance and housing. And I think that both in terms of the problem and also in terms of campaigners for solutions. And so we're really thrilled to have Raquel here today. So thank you so much, Raquel, and I'll hand over to you for about 15 minutes. I'm going to be tight on time. I hope you don't mind.
Thank you, Éilis. Thank you for this incredible opportunity to be here. And thank you, Rodrigo and Michelle, because everything that you brought here, it's a very, very good ground to start from. And just to remind, somebody is asking, we are talking about this book, Urban Warfare, by Verso. And this is a kind of a global view on how housing was financialized and became and shifted everywhere globally from being a human right, a part of a social policy, especially in some countries that had housing as a part of their welfare state schemes. Others no, never, but yes, some countries yes. And how it became a financial asset. A financial asset, and I would say a playground to this wall of money that was referred by Rodrigo and Michelle. I would call it this black cloud of excess finance, which is floating over the world, looking for where to park. And housing, as it was mentioned before here, was a fundamental and is a fundamental place to absorb this liquidity, this excess of capital, in order to generate more finance, more capital, in order to generate more finance and more capital. So I would say housing and real estate are financial assets, even if nobody's living there. They are there only on the books, which means for the profile, for the rating of the different financial actors which are managing this money over the world without any barrier, because states are complicit on taking on any barrier, and make possible for this black cloud to move freely and more, retaking what was said here before, not only not regulating, not stopping this cloud from parking in our territories, but also attracting them and using mechanisms in order to attract them, like real estate investment trusts rates, which was something that was referred. But I was asked to show how much this process is global, so how it parks in the global south. And I'm going to use the example of Latin America, but we can use other examples of African cities, of Asian cities. We can take on many examples from the periphery of capitalism in order to see that the process is global, and the difference of this process between the case of Western Europe or UK or North America and the periphery of capitalism is that in our cases, the majority of the people, and I would say the majority, more than 50% of the people who need housing, who need to be housed, which actually do they house themselves by self-building them in empty land or squatted land, or buying very cheap land in the outskirts of the city, creating non-urbanized settlements. So this is actually the way people are dealing every day with their need for housing. So we are talking about a massive demand of adequate housing, because most of these self-produced homes are not adequate in terms of location, in terms of the nature of the urban space where the settlements are located, without proper infrastructure, for instance, or without proper transportation. We are talking about that. But so what I'm bringing here is that these people that have very, very low incomes have to compete in the residential market with oil sheikhs, with the investment fund of Apple, with the investment fund of Google, with the investment fund of the sovereign fund of Germany, for instance, who is ready to park in the residential market. So guess who's gonna win in the cities? Who's gonna take those residents which are produced by the construction industry? So we are talking about an imbalance, which is even more acute than the imbalance that we are witnessing today in Ireland, in Spain, in many, many cities of United States. But despite that, government and state had promoted financialization of housing as a wonderful scheme for these also countries in the periphery of capitalism. And why, how they have done that, and the good example, I would say the great neoliberal example of social policies in general, housing policies in particular for the so-called global south, was Chile. So what was the solution? Government have adopted, government mobilized state money, state budget, in order to subsidize people and families with very low income to be able to buy the residence or the product produced by the finest, and I will use here the expression that I know that Rodrigo uses a lot, which is real estate financial complex, because real estate and finance is just one thing. We cannot separate them anymore. It's just one thing. So to subsidize people, so give money to the people to buy the products. And when we do that, and I think this is very important for us to discuss, because sometimes because of problems of affordability, some people come with suggestions like, oh, okay, it's not affordable, so let's ask the state to give us vouchers or to give us money for us to be able to pay higher rents or higher mortgages. So this operation, the effect of this operation is to feed the financial bubble and speculation. You put state money into the pockets of financial actors and make viable and make this very speculative market being even more speculative, and you transfer public money, which is not a property of the state, but it's a common property of us, is our common property. You transfer that into those financial actors. So that's one point. The second point that I would like to make, I think it's very important to say that the first wave of financialization of housing globally was around home ownership, the promotion of home ownership. So privatization of social housing, mortgages, subprime mortgages to attract people to buy their homes. So that was the first wave since the 70s until the crash of the bubble and the financial crisis. But then a second wave comes. And the second wave is around rental housing. And this round around rental housing is a new phenomenon, which is the rise of corporate landlords. Part of those corporate landlords came from financial agents buying up stocks of social housing, being municipal stocks of social housing, being cooperative stocks of social housing, depending on the country, and became private landlords and exercising monopoly over the residential market and kicking out very quickly those who cannot pay the rent. And Airbnb and other forms of digital platforms, which make ourselves being agents of the bubble and the speculation in the residential market, are part of this new phenomenon. yes, the same tendency around rental housing is also present in the global south. So this is entering into residential markets, first with student housing, things like that, or housing for elderly. So schemes that are not only with idea of extracting rent from the rental, monthly rent of the people, but also extracting rent from services. So providing services to older or the student, and extracting rent from services, managing that in order to extract constant rent from this building stock. In order to finish my intervention, unfortunately, it's very short time, and I know we are behind here. Solutions. Yes, let's talk about solutions. The most important solution is around the actually housing struggles who are happening everywhere. I believe in Ireland as well, in Brazil a lot. Zero evictions campaigns everywhere around the idea that housing is a human right. And being a human right and not a financial asset, the main role of the governments, the main role of our political leadership is to provide schemes and exactly to cut, and Michelle was referring to that, to cut the umbilical cord that links housing with the circuits of financialization and make housing much more shielded and protected from that. And there are several examples which are being tried over the world. Yes, one of them is, yes, let's talk about, again, social housing. Let's talk about the idea that housing as a human right does not necessarily be a property, a private property. A human right is a human right to access to adequate housing, and the link between the person and the housing must be a secure link, a adequate link, but not necessarily through home ownership. One example, and I will finish by throwing this example on the table, but I think it's very interesting, is cooperative housing. It's the idea that common property became common, and because it's common, it's very complicated for this product to circulate in the market, because in order to circulate this product in the market, you have to negotiate with several families, complicated families. So this remains shielded from the attacks of the financial circuits. So I would say cooperative housing, community land trusts, and other sorts of collective owning, which make very complicated for the built space to circulate in the financial circuit, are the ones who today protect more housing as a human right from the attacks of financial circuits. So I will leave you with that. Again, thank you very, very much for this opportunity.